Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. I remember when Dana started the Conservation League. This is my 30th year at the College of Charleston, and the Conservation League was very important to the development of our anthropology department, and it's a delight to be looking back and looking forward with the League at this particular juncture in time. I certainly would like to thank you for the invitation to be part of the program, and I feel very much among colleagues and friends. It's been a very stimulating gathering, and I'm glad to be a part of it. To reflect on the past quarter century of work and explore the path forward based on an integrated approach to conservation brings into focus the intricate relationship between conservation and the world's diverse religious traditions. This morning, I'd like to briefly explore the religious significance of fig trees worldwide within the biographical framework of Dr. Wangari Maathai. A member of the Kikuyu people, a distinguished Kenyan citizen, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 as the founder of the Greenbelt movement, which by 2010 had planted over 45 million trees across Kenya since 1977. As we look forward to the next 25 years, I intend to argue this morning that the world is in need of clarity concerning the relationship between human religiosity and conservation. And the importance of spiritual values is profoundly reflected in the life of Dr. Maathai, both in her background as a Kikuyu and in her life as a Catholic. I say human religiosity because whenever I talk to students, it's always important to make it clear that you can be whatever you want to be as an individual when it comes to religion. But you should have no doubt that religiosity is the cornerstone of human life. We have never found any people anywhere in the world at any time whose life did not rest on the foundation of human religiosity. It's not by chance that Dr. Wangari Maathai's second book was titled Replenishing the Earth, Spiritual Values for Healing Ourselves and the World. And that in the first paragraph of the introduction she wrote, and I quote, "During my more than 3 decades as an environmentalist and a campaigner for democratic space, people have often asked me whether spirituality, different religious traditions, and the Bible in particular, inspired me and influenced my activism and the work of the Greenbelt movement. Did I conceive conservation of the environment and empowerment of ordinary people as a kind of religious experience or vocation? Are there people," she was asked, spiritual lessons to be learned and applied to environmental effort or to life as a whole? This was a critical question that was posed to Dr. Maathai, and it is a critical question for the Conservation League today. This was a question that people posed to her over the 30 years of her activism. And she makes it clear she was not prepared to answer that question because this is what she wrote in her book, Replenishing the Earth. And this book, Replenishing the Earth, the spiritual values for healing ourselves and the world, was her response to this question 30 years later. She says, during the 3 decades, she made it clear to her supporters that her, in quotes, motivation came from thinking literally and practically about how to solve problems on the ground. It was a desire to help rural populations, especially women, with the basic needs that they described to me during seminars and workshops. They said that they lacked clean drinking water, adequate and nutritious food, income, and enough energy for cooking and heating. She also wrote, quote, "Personally, I never differentiated between activities that might be called spiritual and those that might be termed secular." I've had this experience all over the world and constantly. I remember in Brazil, and I'll say a little bit about the people in Brazil, I was interested about their spiritual ideas about a particular tree, and I kept pressing the person, "Is this tree sacred?" And after a while, exasperatedly, she looked at me and she says, "All the trees are sacred. We can pick any tree we like," right? And this is what Dr. Maathai was saying. I never differentiated between activities that might be called spiritual and those that might be termed secular. This is a critical point that has come up often in my field research and I will return to shortly. The 4 core values of her Greenbelt movement, she said, were love of the environment, gratitude and respect for the earth's resources, self-empowerment and self-betterment, and the spirit of service and volunteerism. These values, she wrote, encapsulates the intangible, subtle, non-materialist aspects of the Greenbelt movement, and they define our humanity. It's interesting that she stayed away from particularizing religion and gave it the quality of our humanity, because that's really what I'd like to address today, that there is in fact a commonality in our humanity with regards to plants. And I picked fig trees for the very simple reason that they have afforded us the opportunity for such a perspective. There's an estimated 800 to 1,000 species of figs. They occur throughout the tropics. They've been isolated by human beings everywhere. And I don't think it would be incorrect to say that the most sacred tree to us as human beings is in fact a member of the genus Ficus. Now, continuing with Dr. Maathai's comment, she says, underlying the narrative of the Greenbelt movement is Maathai's experience growing up as a young Kikuyu, an experience that clearly has shaped the person she ultimately became. In her first book, Unbowed, a memoir, she tells that she had always loved nature and that collecting firewood for the household was a frequent activity she did to help her mother. Quotes, "The country was dotted with hundreds of huge migomo, or wild fig trees, Ficus natalensis. Their bark, the color of elephant skin and thick, gnarled branches with roots springing out and anchoring the tree to the ground. Fig trees had great canopies beneath which grew dense undergrowth. This tree's canopy was probably 60 feet in diameter, and it produced numerous fruits that birds loved." All of us know that figs are the most important keystone species in tropical forests. It's curious that they've evolved to be pollinated by a single wasp, each species, and yet they've evolved to be dispersed by probably one of the widest array of species in the tropical environment. She said, when the fruit was ready, we would find hundreds of birds feeding on them. The undergrowth of the fig tree is also very fertile because people did not cut anything near those trees, but allowed the undergrowth to flourish. All this added to the tree's mystery. When my mother told me to go and fetch firewood, she would warn me, don't pick any dry wood out of the fig tree or even around it. Why, I would ask? Because that's the tree of God, she said. We don't use it, we don't cut it, we don't burn it. As a child, of course, I had no idea what my mother was talking about, but I obeyed her. Later on, she said, I'm saying this, but later on I'll make reference back to it. The fig of the Kikuyu is really God's tree, not in the sense that it is a cosmic tree, which is one of the important significance of trees to people, but in the sense that it is God's altar. In the 19th century, it was common in talking about African religion to say that they worship trees and things like that. These are quite erroneous ideas. The tree is God's altar. That's where they place their offerings to God. Dr. Maathai tells us about 200 yards from the fig tree, there was a stream named Kanugu, with water so clean and fresh that we drank it straight from the stream. She remembers the garden of arrowroot, banana, and sugarcane. She remembers playing with frogs' eggs and tadpoles and frogs. She said, I later learned that there was a connection between the fig tree's root system and the underground water reservoirs. Indeed, wherever these trees stood, there were likely to be streams. The reverence the community had for the fig tree helped preserve the stream and tadpoles that so captivated me. She continued, the tree also held the soil together, reduced erosion, and prevented landslides. In such ways, without consciousness or deliberate effort, these cultural and spiritual practices contributed to the conservation of biological diversity. With the development of commercial and agriculture that came with colonization, she wrote in her first book, Unbowed, a memoir published in 2007, ironically, the era where the fig tree of my childhood once stood always remained a patch of bare ground where nothing grew. It was as if the land rejected anything but the fig tree itself. And so now I'm going to take you on a little journey about figs. human life and conservation. One more? What you see here is a young Ficus netalensis trees. A large section of figs are called stranglers because this is how they compete. In the tropical forest, light is scarce at ground level, and so they start off growing in the canopy and send roots down. They slowly entwine their hosts, kill them, and take their place. That's why they're called stranglers. Can you imagine a group of human beings anywhere in the world unmoved by a tree capable of such behavior? This is a young fig. You see one slightly more mature, and you see one in the style of a bonsai. It is an immense tree, an impressive tree. But why was it called God's tree, and where does the term come from, and how common is it? In fact, in Jamaica, we call this cotton tree God's tree. That's the name we give it. And all these names reflect is that trees are the great connector between the sky and the earth. God tree in this case means a tree that grows up to the sky and therefore is a conduit between humanity and the world of God. In the case of fig trees, it's God's tree because it's a tree that grows from the sky down to earth. It's a tree that comes from the realm of God to the world of humanity. Here you can see two varieties of saber trees, one in the Caribbean and one in Brazil. But we know that this is how people think because there are other examples. I'm going to just give you some very quick ones. The plant you see on the left, I have to keep remembering where I am in this project. The plant you see on your left there, that bush is called God bush. It's a kind of mistletoe, and it's called God bush because it scorns the earth. It only grows in the heavens and not in the soil, right? The bird that you see there, the swallowtail hummingbird, the national bird of Jamaica, is called God's bird. Who else could such a magnificent creature be associated with? And the plant you see there is called God okra. You see the real okra in the bottom corner. It's called God okra because it too is an epiphytic cactus. It grows in the canopy of trees, and they eat it, and it's mucilaginous, a lot like okra, and hence the name God okra. But even by accident, you can see the significance of the cosmic tree. These are just walls. This is not staged. I just took these pictures casually in passing. And what they represent is the fact that ancient people modeled the universe on a tree. That's what cosmic tree means. It means that the canopy of the tree was the sky above, the root was the earth below. And the surface where the tree trunk intersect with the surface is this center of the world in which we live. And the intersection, the most sacred place where spiritual energy was concentrated. This is what they had in mind, a modeling of the cosmos in relationship to the tree. And these are just spontaneous examples on walls in Brazil. The one, Ficus clucifolia on the left, Ficus gomularia on the right. But this, as I said, is the most sacred tree to people worldwide. It was to the Egyptians with Ficus sycamorus, which is along the major river valleys throughout Africa. Here you see an example of Ficus sycamorus. We don't have to wonder why this tree should have been so stimulated to the Egyptians, especially when you see it in fruit, and it's covered with fruit along the entire length of the trunk of the tree. Not only among the Egyptians was it sacred, however, but in the northeastern part of Brazil, where we have the legacy of sugar and slavery. There, the people also regard figs as their sacred tree. It is the most sacred place to them in the center of their religious shrine. And it is associated with a particular orisha called Iroko, the orisha of the sacred tree, so to speak. These trees are always set apart by a low wall and what is called an ojo around the tree itself, and so on. And here you can see an example of what their religious rites are like, and cotton trees which are important to them. Now, this large tree on the left is Ficus cycophyllum. Today it's in the middle of the city of Salvador, but it once was the landscape of a very important Tejero to them. And when they lost the control of the Tejero, they were still retained the right to the tree, and even to this day, they still protect it and mark it as a tree of distinction. And if you travel through all their sanctuaries, this is what you're going to see. Every one of them has a sacred fig at the heart of it, and it is not by chance. And here, perhaps the most powerful spokesperson for Candomblé up in the upper right-hand corner, Ma Estela, that evening when I spent with them at her Tejero Afonja, they were celebrating 100 years of Candomblé. And right next to where people were sitting was their cosmic fig, in this case, Ficus eliotiana. But figs are everywhere, that's my whole point, and they excite the human imagination in the same way. That's the point I'm making to you. But some of us have lost track of it, and this is true even of my fellow Caribbean people in the Caribbean. This is the island of Barbados. Not many people know that Barbados was named after a fig. The word comes from the Portuguese or Spanish, os barbados, the bearded ones. I wonder how many Charlestonians know that, given the fact that Barbados played such a pivotal role in the early history of Charleston. But the curious thing is, if you look at this next picture, you can see that it's on their national coat of arms. In the center of the shield is a Ficus citrifolia, the bearded fig. There's an example of one growing in one of the few remaining natural remnants of the flora of the island, and one of Barbados' most important bonsai artists doing a Ficus citrifolia. And yet, if you go to their national museum, right next to the museum is this beautiful Ficus citrifolia. There is no sign directing you to it, no sign indicating that it's a national tree, no explanation whatsoever. In fact, it shocked me to know when I spoke to many young Barbadians, they didn't even realize that the bearded fig was on their coat of arms and was the source of the name of their island. There's a distinguished Barbados poet who tried to protect a little bearded fig that was threatened. And this is what he wrote to the government and to Caribbean people. His name was Camus Brathwaite, and he wrote a letter that was directed to, he said, to all Caribbean artists, intellectuals, cultural workers, and environmentalists. In it, he described the way in which, in quotes, unnecessary and unethical government road building project associated with access to the airport was destroying the environment that was linked especially to a small bearded fig tree. And this was his direct, what he had to say directly. Even as I write this, destruction is going on. This old plantation well, the little lake or pond of thorn, the natural water catchment for this era, filled in and flattened, hence future floods. And near the well a fledgling bearded fig, shrine of ancient African and Amerindian spirits, its cinnamon beard just showing a dear endangered species, cruelly, unethically soon to gone. I could go on and on. And then he said of it, Rosina said this morning, I should write it down. But write it down for whom? Write it down for what? I can't accept it so unfairly to continue. This is a tree. This is the bearded fig he was talking about, and much as I support Dr. Brathwaite and his concern, it's hardly an endangered tree because among trees, figs are the most aggressive competitors that we face. And if you travel through Barbados, these figs are everywhere. You can see growing on the cuts along roadsides, colonizing trees in tourist environments, colonizing buildings throughout the city and rooftops. If you ever had to deal with this tree, you know it's enormously expensive and dangerous to deal with this particular tree. You cannot kill it just by cutting off the branches. No matter how often you cut it back, it will grow back. This is why people love it. This is why the people of Africa love it. This is why they use it for fencing, and this is why they use it for boundaries. This is why they use it to feed their animals. It's infinitely renewable, right? And I thought to myself, here's a beautiful example of the national tree. I wondered why they didn't leave it. It's right in the middle of the city, so when the cruise ships come in and disgorge these large numbers of people, at least they could see what their national symbol looks like. But they wouldn't hear of it. This tree was cut down not long after I took the picture. But they're everywhere. The famous St. John's Church, where most visitors would go on the east coast of Barbados, you could see this Ficus citrifolia has killed its host, and it has seedlings growing on all the old historic graves in the site. And as you travel around the island, you will see people sitting on the Ficus microcarpa, which was introduced to the island. It's their most favorite shade tree at bus stops, roadsides, and inside their shopping mall, Ficus elastica became one of the most important ornamental plants in Western countries and here in the United States early on, the classic rubber tree. Ficus lyrata, sacred to the people of West Africa, and now common in hotels throughout the Caribbean. And you see them being sold in shops and nurseries and the like. This is Ficus lyrata. And here, Ficus primula. This is a vine from China that covers quite a bit of the walls here in Charleston. I was shocked to know that many of my students had never seen it in fruit. Here you can see what the fruit looks like. It's actually edible fruit. And if you want to see it in fruit now in Charleston, you can. Just go down St. Philip Street past Wentworth. There's a huge wall and the tree's in full fruit. Most people, I don't think, have even taken note of that. But even here, Ficus microcarpa at the entrance to churches, just as it stands in relationship to shrines. And of all the figs spread around the world, this is the only one that has become naturalized in many places. It's so in the Pacific, in Hawaii, in Florida, an extraordinarily aggressive fig. And it has never been reported as naturalized in Barbados, but it is. Here you can see it killing a mahogany tree. And, but I'm just showing you how widespread this particular group of trees is, how universally it fits into our lives as human beings if you stop to take a look at it. Here, for example, they're magnificent up close. This is Ficus benjamina in Welshman's Gully in Barbados. And around the old plantation homes are great fig trees that still stand today, as you see also in this picture. Some of them are just grown for making hedges, as you see here. I estimate there are about 35 species of figs in Barbados, and only one of them native, which is the bearded fig, the Ficus citrifolia. Of course, figs are the most sacred trees to the people of India as well. There's the Ficus bengalensis and the Ficus religiosa, under which the Buddha was enlightened. This is a Ficus bengalensis, one of the world's largest spreading trees in this sense. Here you can see the famous one that grows in Calcutta, oftentimes said to be as large as a football field. Here is the Ficus religiosa, under which the Buddha was enlightened. This is actually the tree at Bodh Gaya in India, pieces of which were taken to Sri Lanka and elsewhere, and they claim are the descendants of this original tree. And even here in Thailand, I've read books. This is in Ayutthaya, the ancient capital of Thailand. And I've read books, and they describe this famous image as in a Ficus religiosa tree, but in fact it's Ficus rumphii. And here in Thailand, people who regard the earth as so sacred that every place has a spirit associated with it, and they build these spirit houses. And they so honor these things that you can't arbitrarily dispose of them. If you move or something, you have to take it and dispose of it properly. So they put them at the foot of fig trees from where they're then taken up and disposed of properly. This is a Ficus elastica tree, the same rubber tree that for us is just an indoor ornamental, tolerant of abusive treatment and poor light. The one on the left is the Ficus religiosa of the Buddha. And the last few slides I'm just going to show you, this is Ficus Petra Larson in northern Mexico. Dr. Bob Bai, my good friend and colleague, took us and a group of students from the College of Charleston on a tour in which we stopped and visited these magnificent trees. I think he did it in honor of my obsession. And I was very grateful, but I can assure you that it was also impressive to the student. How can you not be impressed by a tree of such enormous size that can grow on the sheer wall of a cliff? It's absolutely astonishing.
John, I do think we need to wrap up in the interest of time, getting to David so everyone can ask questions of...
I have wrapped up.
Oh, wonderful. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to...
No, I was done, actually.
Okay. Well...
But I just wanted to share with you that when we talk about nature and about plants and about environments, it's not abstract to the people in the world that we're talking about. These people have very deep links to the natural world that are at the core of their religious and human values. And we're going to have to access this if we're going to inspire people to meet the challenges of environment and human life in the future. And that's really the message I wanted to share with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was so interesting to see a specific example of what Mary Evelyn was talking about in the connection between humans and the natural world and us humans finding meaning in the natural world. So now